Ever feel like you're hitting a wall? You know, one of those moments where something just seems totally immovable?
Oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
It reminds me of this Zen story, about a king. This king put this huge boulder smack in the middle of a road, like a main road everyone used.
What happened?
All the bigwigs, the important people, they'd come along and grumble and maybe give it a half-hearted shove, but they'd turn back, defeated.
Makes sense, I guess. Who wants to deal with that?
But then this peasant comes along, doesn't just accept it, gets to work, figures out a way, uses a lever, and moves the thing.
Must have taken some real effort.
He did, and you know what he finds underneath? A message from the king. It says, "The obstacle in the path becomes the path."
Wow.
That's what we're diving into today, that whole idea. Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is the Way.
I've heard of it.
It's about how we deal with those boulders in our lives. Instead of seeing them as like stop signs, we can see them as opportunities to grow, to learn, even to become more succession.
So not a how to avoid problems book?
Not at all. More like a how to make the problems work for you kind of thing.
Interesting.
I know there are tons of self-improvement books out there, and it can be kind of overwhelming, right?
Absolutely.
But this one's different. It's got this framework for dealing with challenges that feels really practical, almost timeless, you know?
But that's the secret sauce.
Well, Holiday breaks it down into three main things: perception, action, and will. He says if we get good at those three things, we can change how we see obstacles. Instead of seeing them as dead ends, we can actually use them to get where we want to be.
Okay, so those are the big three.
And get this, he's not making this stuff up. Holiday pulls a lot from Stoicism.
Stoicism, like the ancient Greek philosophy.
The very same. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, he takes their wisdom and makes it work for us today.
I'm intrigued.
So that's what this deep dive is all about. We're going to go through the book chapter by chapter, pick out the big lessons, and figure out how to actually use them, in our own lives.
I'm ready when you are.
All right, let's jump in. Perception. What is it?
Basic stuff, right?
Well, the book says it's how we see and understand what's happening around us, but it's more than that. It's about the meaning we give to things.
So same event, different people, different meanings.
Exactly. And that's where it gets interesting. Our perceptions can make us strong or they can make us weak.
Like, if I see a problem as the end of the world, I'm not going to be very effective at solving it.
Right. If we just react emotionally or only see things from our own limited point of view, we actually make the obstacles seem bigger and harder to deal with.
Makes sense.
So the book says we've got to learn to manage those knee-jerk emotional reactions. We need to calm down, be more objective when things get tough.
Easier said than done, I think.
It definitely takes work. It takes discipline to push aside all that noise, our biases, expectations, fears, all that stuff.
And what's the payoff?
A much clearer picture of what's actually going on. When everyone else is freaking out, we can stay grounded, see things simply, factually, without all the drama.
I could see how that would be a huge advantage.
The book says it is, and to prove it, it brings up John D. Rockefeller.
Rockefeller, the oil tycoon.
Yeah, but before all that, he was just a young guy working as a bookkeeper in Ohio.
Okay.
And then, boom, the Panic of 1857 hits, this massive financial crisis.
I can imagine that was a defining moment for him.
It was. Rockefeller really learned from it. He saw that the market can be totally unpredictable, sometimes even brutal.
So how did he react?
He realized the only way to survive was to stay rational, to keep a level head. He saw other people getting caught up in the frenzy, and he decided right then and there that he wasn't going to be one of them.
Smart move.
It was. And that lesson stuck with him throughout his career.
Even when he was building Standard Oil.
Especially then. The book says that even when he was starting out, Rockefeller would turn down what looked like great deals if they felt too risky, too speculative. He even returned investments when he felt the underlying ventures weren't solid, even though everyone else was jumping on board.
Wow, that takes some serious discipline.
It does, but it paid off big time.
So he basically stayed calm when everyone else was losing their minds.
Exactly. And because of that, he was able to make some really smart moves when the market was unstable. He actually made a lot of his fortune during those times.
It's like that saying, be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful.
Precisely. But Rockefeller was doing it way before Warren Buffett.
And it wasn't just about money, was it?
Not at all. The book talks about how Standard Oil was incredibly adaptable. Every time competitors or the government tried to take them down, they would change, restructure, find a way to keep going.
Like a chameleon.
Yeah, sort of. They were always changing to fit the situation. And Rockefeller was always calm, never rattled, no matter what was thrown at him. Economic downturns, bad business deals, even lawsuits, nothing seemed to faze him.
It's incredible, really, to think how much he achieved.
It is. And the big takeaway for us is this. We're all going to face obstacles. Some fair, some not. But what really matters is how we respond to them. Our reaction, our perception of the situation, that's what determines whether we sink or swim.
So it's not the obstacle itself, but how we see it.
Exactly. The book says one person might see a crisis while another sees opportunity.
I like that.
Where one person gets blinded by early success, another stays grounded and realistic. Where one person loses their cool, another stays calm and focused.
So those negative feelings, desperation, fear, those are coming from our perceptions, not necessarily from the situation itself.
Right. And we have a choice. We can let those feelings control us, or we can choose to be like Rockefeller, rational, objective, in control.
Okay, I'm starting to see the power of perception.
Think about it. Have you ever been in a situation that felt totally overwhelming at the time, but looking back, you realize it wasn't that bad?
Oh yeah, plenty of times.
And wasn't it your perception of the situation that made it seem so much worse?
You know, you're right. I was letting my emotions get the best of me.
And the book's point is that we can learn to do that less, to see things more clearly even when things are tough.
And you said the book relates this to what's going on in the world today.
Yeah, it talks about how we're kind of living in our own Gilded Age with economic uncertainty, technology changing everything, and so much anxiety.
Which makes sense. There's a lot going on.
There is, but the book says we can't let those feelings, that initial panic, take over. It's like we're wired to see threats everywhere, even when they're not really there.
Our caveman brains.
Haha, pretty much. We get stressed about money, we freak out in meetings, when in reality, we're not in any real danger.
Right.
So instead of just reacting, the book says we should try to see things rationally.
Like Rockefeller with the market crash.
Exactly. Or even better, we can look for the opportunities hidden within the problems. A chance to learn something new, develop a skill, or maybe even just get lucky.
Turning lemons into lemonade.
I like that. Have you ever had a setback that actually turned out to be a good thing in the long run?
You know, I think I have. There was that time I got laid off from.
And wouldn't you say that it was your perception of that event that changed things?
Totally. At first I was devastated, but then I realized it was a chance to.
Exactly. So the book gives us some really practical advice for how to cultivate that more objective perception.
Like what?
Well, it says we should be objective, of course, not let our emotions run wild. But we should also try to focus on the good in every situation. Steady our nerves, ignore distractions, put things into perspective, focus on the present moment, and most importantly, focus on the things we can actually control.
That's a lot to keep in mind.
It is, but it's all about building good mental habits.
And then the book brings up James Stockdale.
Oh man, Stockdale's story is incredible. He was a prisoner of war for years, but he never gave up hope.
How did he do it?
He focused on what he could control. He couldn't control his physical situation, but he could control his mind. He studied law, philosophy, history. He basically decided that his captors could take his body, but they couldn't take his spirit.
That's powerful.
It is, and it shows the power of choosing your perception. Stockdale could have easily given in to despair, but he chose to see his situation as an opportunity for growth.
So he changed the story he was telling himself.
Exactly. And we can do the same thing. Just because something feels terrible doesn't mean it is terrible. We always have the power to choose how we see things.
All right, so we've got perception. What's next?
Next up is the idea of steadying our nerves, staying calm under pressure.
I think I need help with that one.
Haha, we all do. But the book uses Ulysses S. Grant as an example of someone who is really good at it.
Grant. The Civil War general.
Yep. There are these crazy stories about him, like one time a skylight shattered above him during a photo shoot, glass flying everywhere, and he didn't even flinch.
Wow.
Or that time a cannonball exploded right next to him, killed his horse, and he just kept right on looking through his binoculars like nothing happened.
That's some serious composure.
It is, and think about how we react to pressure. A computer crashes, a client yells at us, our plans fall apart. Do we stay calm and collected like Grant?
Probably not.
Probably not. We freak out, get stressed, lose our focus, and the book says that's exactly what we shouldn't do. Because when we're stressed, we don't think clearly. We make bad decisions.
And when we're trying to achieve big things, pressure is inevitable.
Right. So we need to learn to deal with it. We need grace and poise, especially when things get tough.
So nerve is about more than just not being afraid.
Definitely. It's about defiance, control, acceptance. It's saying, this is happening, but I'm not going to let it break me.
And when we can do that, the obstacle loses its power.
Right. It becomes just another problem to solve. And speaking of staying calm, the book then talks about controlling our emotions.
Now that's a tough one.
It is, but it starts with this really cool example. The early astronauts.
The space race.
Yep. Those guys went through intense training, and one of the most important things they learned was how to stay calm under pressure.
Like how not to freak out in space.
Exactly, because when you're up there facing all those unknowns, if you panic, you make mistakes. You could even die.
I can see how that would be a top priority.
It was, and the book points out that John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth, was amazing at this. He spent a whole day in space, and his heart rate never went above 100 beats per minute.
That's incredible.
It is, but then it asks, how do we handle pressure? When we have a tough conversation, a big presentation, even just a disagreement with someone, do we stay calm?
I know I don't always.
Most of us don't. Our hearts race, we get that sinking feeling in our stomach, our palms sweat. And the book asks, does getting upset actually help us in those situations?
I guess not.
Right, it just makes things worse. So the book isn't saying we should ignore our emotions. It's saying we need to learn to control them.
Manage them, not deny them.
Exactly. It's like Nassim Taleb said, we need to domesticate our emotions.
Interesting analogy.
If you need a minute to process something, to cry, to just feel what you're feeling, that's fine. But then we have to regain control. Don't let the emotions take over.
And how do we do that?
The book says we should use logic and reason. Ask ourselves questions.
Give me an example.
Okay, say you have a financial setback. Ask yourself, is this a normal part of business? Are the losses really that bad, or is it just a temporary dip? Were there any warning signs I missed?
And by thinking it through, we might realize it's not as bad as it seems.
Right. Our emotions can make things seem way scarier than they actually are.
It's like we're exaggerating the problem.
Exactly. And the book introduces this cool concept from Musashi, the Japanese swordsman. He talks about the observing eye and the perceiving eye.
What's the difference?
The observing eye just sees things as they are. No judgment, no assumptions, no baggage. The perceiving eye, though, sees things through the lens of our fears and biases.
So the observing eye is more objective.
Exactly. And that's the eye we want to use when we're dealing with challenges. The perceiving eye just makes things harder. It sees problems where there might not even be any.
Interesting.
The book asks, how many of our problems come from putting judgments on things we can't even control?
Like expecting things to be a certain way and then freaking out when they're not.
Yep. And our brains are wired to react quickly. We see something, we feel something, we act.
Instant reaction.
But the book says we need to learn to slow down that process. Pause before we react.
Like that deer that runs into traffic because it's startled.
Exactly. We're not deer. We have the ability to think things through. But that takes practice.
So how do we practice pausing?
The book suggests a mental exercise. When you're feeling overwhelmed, try to detach from the situation. Pretend it's not happening to you.
Distance yourself from it.
Yeah, like you're watching it on TV. That way you can see things more clearly without all the emotional baggage.
I like that.
And the book talks about how the ancient Greeks understood this idea. They knew we tend to jump to the worst conclusions, when usually there's a simpler explanation.
Like overthinking it.
Totally. And they also knew that changing how we see things can change how we feel about things.
Makes sense.
So the book emphasizes the power of perspective.
Perspective.
Yeah. And there are two kinds, context and framing. Context is the big picture, the whole situation. Framing is how we choose to interpret it.
So two people can look at the same thing and see it completely differently.
Exactly. And we can actually choose to change both our context and our framing.
Give me an example.
Okay, think about George Clooney. Early in his career, he kept getting rejected for roles.
I can't imagine that.
Ha ha ha, right? But at first, he blamed the system. He thought Hollywood was rigged against him.
That's a pretty common feeling.
It is, but then he changed his perspective. He decided to focus on his craft, on getting better as an actor, and that made all the difference.
So he stopped worrying about things he couldn't control and focused on what he could.
Exactly. And the book reminds us of something Epictetus said. We should focus on the things we can control, our emotions, our actions, our efforts.
And let go of the things we can't.
Right, like other people's opinions, or the economy, or the weather.
Easier said than done, though.
It is, but it's worth practicing. And speaking of focusing on what we can control, the book tells this amazing story about Tommy John.
The baseball player?
Yep. He had this career-ending injury, a torn ligament in his elbow.
I think I remember hearing about that.
Well, back then, that was it. Your career was over. But Tommy John didn't accept that.
What did he do?
He kept asking his doctors, is there any chance at all that I can pitch again?
And
They told him there was this new surgery, but it was risky, experimental.
like a 1 in a million chance.
Maybe even less. But he did it, and guess what? He not only recovered, he came back and won hundreds more games.
No way.
It's true. And later his son had a terrible accident. And again, Tommy John kept asking, is there any chance? And his son made a full recovery too.
It's almost like he loved them both back to health.
The book's point is that he focused on what he could do. He didn't give up. He didn't dwell on the negative. He kept looking for a way forward.
So powerful.
It is. And it shows that when we focus on what's in our control, we actually become more powerful.
That's a great lesson.
And it leads us to the last chapter in the section on perception, live in the present moment.
Okay, mindfulness stuff.
Sort of, but with a twist. The book starts by listing all these hugely successful companies that were founded during really bad economic times.
Like during recessions.
Yep. Companies like Fortune Magazine, FedEx, Microsoft.
You'd think those would be the worst times to start a business.
You would, but the book says that those founders were probably too busy dealing with the day-to-day challenges to worry about the bigger picture.
They were just focused on getting things done.
Exactly. They had a job to do, a product to build, customers to find. They didn't waste time worrying about the economy or the past.
They lived in the present moment.
And it worked. The book says that half of the Fortune 500 companies were actually started during bad economic times.
That's incredible.
It is, and the lesson is that we tend to overthink things. We get caught up in the why of things when we should be focusing on the what. What can I do right now?
So stop worrying and start doing.
Exactly. Focus on the present moment, on the task at hand. Don't get bogged down in the big picture. Just take things one step at a time.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered perception. What's next?
Now we're moving into action. And the first chapter in this section is Think Differently.
Sounds exciting.
It is, and the book uses Steve Jobs as the ultimate example of this.
Steve Jobs. Mr. Apple?
The one and only. The book talks about his reality distortion field.
What's that?
Basically, it was his ability to make people believe anything was possible. He would just refuse to accept limitations.
Like there shall be no Alps.
Ha ha, exactly. And there's this famous story about the first Apple mouse. Jobs wanted a mouse that could move in any direction, which was a crazy idea back then.
And
One of his engineers told him it was impossible, so Jobs fired him. The very next guy said, "Yeah, I can do that."
no hesitation.
Nope, and that's the point. Jobs didn't let other people's doubts limit him. He had this incredible self-belief, and it wasn't delusional, it was strategic.
He knew what he wanted, and he wasn't afraid to go after it.
Exactly. And the book says that most of us are taught to be too realistic, too cautious. We're afraid to challenge the status quo.
Play it safe.
Right. But that can hold us back from achieving great things. Our doubts have very little to do with what's actually possible.
It's all in our heads.
A lot of it is. And there's another great story about the original Macintosh.
The computer.
Yep, they were on a super tight deadline to ship it, and the engineers told Jobs they needed 2 more weeks.
And what did he say?
He said, if you can do it in 2 weeks, you can do it in 1. And they did.
Just like that.
Pretty much. Jobs pushed them beyond what they thought was possible.
So he believed in them more than they believed in themselves.
You could say that, and it's important to remember that Jobs was kicked out of Apple in the 80s because his plans for the company were considered too radical.
Too ambitious.
Exactly. But guess what? He was right.
His lunatic plan turned out to be pretty successful.
It did, and there's another story about the first iPhone. Jobs wanted a special kind of glass for the screen, and when the manufacturer said they couldn't make enough of it, he told them, "Don't be afraid, you can do this." And they did.
He really had a way of inspiring people.
He did, and the book challenges us to rethink this idea of being realistic.
To be more ambitious?
Exactly, to think bigger, to challenge our assumptions. And it defines an entrepreneur as someone who believes they can create something new, even when it seems impossible.
So not just someone who starts a business.
Right. It's a mindset. It's about seeing possibilities where others see obstacles.
Okay, I like that.
And the book uses a really interesting example from World War II, the Blitzkrieg.
The German tactic.
Yep. It was so successful because it created this perception of overwhelming force. The enemy would just give up before the fight even started.
Psychological warfare.
Exactly. But then it talks about Dwight Eisenhower and how he refused to let the Allied commanders be intimidated by the Germans.
He didn't buy into the hype.
And because of that, the Allies were able to turn the tide of the war.
So our perception of a situation and our enemy's perception of us can make a huge difference.
A huge difference. And often our biggest obstacle is our own preconceived notions, our own beliefs about what's possible.
We limit ourselves.
We do. The book gives an example of having a bad boss. Most people see that as a horrible situation.
Rightfully so, I think.
But the book says we can choose to see it differently. We can see it as a chance to learn, to grow, to maybe even find a better job.
Turning a negative into a positive.
Exactly. And it also says we can reframe our perspective on rivals or competitors.
The people we're always trying to beat.
Yep. Instead of seeing them as just annoying, we can see them as motivation.
How so?
Well, they keep us on our toes, they push us to be better, they make us more resilient, and they show us what not to do.
Interesting.
It's all about finding the good in the bad, even if it's hidden.
So we need to be ready to act, even when things are tough.
And that leads us to the discipline of action.
The doing part.
Right, and the book focuses on Demosthenes, the famous Athenian orator.
I'm not familiar with him.
Well, he was a great speaker, but he had a lot of challenges early on. He was sickly, had a speech impediment, and lost all of the money.
Not exactly the ideal start.
Not at all. But then he saw this amazing speaker in court, and it inspired him.
It sparked something in him.
It did. He decided he wanted to be just like that guy. So he started practicing nonstop. Every conversation, every interaction was a chance to get better.
What kind of things did he do?
He would practice speaking with pebbles in his mouth to improve his articulation. He fought legal battles just to get experience speaking in court. He turned his struggles into fuel for his success.
Wow, that's dedication.
It is. And someone once asked him what the 3 most important traits of speaking were, and he said, action, action, action.
Makes sense. You can't get better just by thinking about it.
Exactly. And the book asks us, when we face a challenge, do we give up or do we fight?
Do we shy away or lean in?
Exactly. And we tend to procrastinate, to put things off. We tell ourselves we're too busy, too tired, too overwhelmed. But the book says that's just an excuse.
Avoidance.
Yep. And inaction never solves anything. In fact, it usually makes things worse.
So we have to force ourselves to act, even when it's hard.
We do. And the book reminds us that it's not about what happens to us. It's about what we do about it.
Our response defines us.
It does. And there are so many stories of people who overcame incredible obstacles, but they all have one thing in common. They didn't give up.
They took action.
They did. And it's okay to feel bad for a little while, but then we got to get back to work.
Back to the grind.
It's like Amelia Earhart. She was offered a chance to be part of the first female transatlantic flight.
That's a big deal.
It was. But the terms weren't great. She wouldn't even be the main pilot. The pay was lousy, and it was incredibly dangerous.
So why did she do it?
Because she knew the importance of just starting, of getting the ball rolling. And that one decision led to all sorts of amazing opportunities for her.
So action breeds more action.
It does. And then there's Rommel, the German general.
The desert fox.
Yep. He was so successful because he was relentless. He kept pushing forward, never giving the enemy a chance to catch their breath.
Always on the offensive.
Always. And that leads us to the next chapter, practice persistence.
Keep going, keep going.
Right. And this one focuses on Ulysses S. Grant again, specifically his campaign to capture Vicksburg.
Vicksburg.
It was a key strategic city during the Civil War. Grant tried for almost a year to take it. Direct assaults, flanking maneuvers, even digging canals, nothing worked.
Sounds frustrating.
It was. The newspapers were all over him. Even Lincoln was thinking about replacing him.
But he didn't give up.
He didn't. He knew there had to be a way, and eventually he came up with this crazy plan.
What did he do?
He ran his ships past the Confederate guns, cutting his army off from their supplies.
That's risky.
Super risky. But it worked, and then he laid siege to Vicksburg, making it clear that he wasn't going anywhere until he won.
So persistence paid off.
Big time. And from then on, Grant knew that persistence was one of his greatest strengths.
It forced him to be creative.
It did, and the book says we need to be the same way. When we face obstacles, we can't give up. We have to keep pushing, keep trying new things.
Like Margaret Thatcher said, the lady's not for turning.
Exactly, and we often think that success comes from some brilliant stroke of genius.
The eureka moment.
Right, but the book says that's usually not how it works. More often, it's just slow, steady effort. Keep trying, keep learning, eliminate what doesn't work.
Just keep chipping away at it.
Yep. And for most things, skill isn't the limiting factor. It's patience and persistence.
The willingness to keep going.
Exactly. And once you've started, quitting shouldn't even be an option.
Easier said than done, though.
It is. But think about Thomas Edison. He famously said, genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration.
I've heard that one.
It's true, and it's the same with overcoming obstacles. We have to be willing to put in the work, to keep going, even when it's tough.
Embrace the grind.
Embrace the grind. And the book encourages us to think like a startup.
Always experimenting, always learning.
Exactly, because failure is just part of the process. It's how we learn and get better. The key is to not let the fear of failure stop us from taking action.
Don't let it paralyze you.
Right. And the book says that successful people aren't afraid to fail. They know what's going to happen, and they don't let it get them down.
They just get back up and keep going.